Imagine you're standing in a packed, dimly lit cathedral.
Oh, wow. Okay. Setting the scene.
Yeah, we're going right into it.
Yeah.
So you're in Kyiv. The year is roughly 1853. The air is, just thick with incense.
Right.
And the room is strictly divided by this very rigid, suffocating social hierarchy. So standing near the front, in full military regalia, is Governor General Dmitry Bibikov.
The absolute unquestioned authority in the region.
Exactly. A man who literally holds the power of life and death over millions of people. And the congregation is just dead silent.
As you would be around a guy like that.
Right. But then, out of nowhere, a young man breaks from the crowd, walks right up to the terrifying Governor General, and just slaps him hard across the face.
It's honestly an act so shocking, so completely outside the realm of what was considered, possible in the Russian Empire at that time. I mean, it almost defies belief.
It's wild.
Yeah, the physical breach of that rigid social order was just unimaginable.
And what makes it even more fascinating is that we almost lost the literary masterpiece that this specific event inspired. So, welcome to the deep dive. Our mission today is to explore a 19th century piece of history that survived by an absolute thread.
Yes, Shevchenko's unfinished poem, Yurodivyi.
Which translates to The Holy Fool. And if you're listening to this, you might be wondering, well, why does an unfinished poem from 1857 even matter to you today?
Right, it sounds like dusty old history, but it's really not.
It's not. We're looking at a text that features a lost manuscript, a violent public rebellion in a church, and, surprisingly enough, a direct shout-out to George Washington.
Yeah, it is an incredibly dense, fiery text. And I mean, to set the stage, it's important to understand what we're actually analyzing today. We are looking at the fully academically verified text of the poem, which was published by the Shevchenko Institute of Literature.
Which is great.
Right. But, as you alluded to, the physical survival of this text is, it's a miracle in itself.
Because the original manuscript, the one Shevchenko actually touched and wrote on, is just gone.
Completely lost to history, yeah. The original autograph was held in the private archive of Shevchenko's friend, Levko Dzhemchuzhnikov. And, somewhere along the line, it just vanished.
Wow.
We only have this text today because a researcher and writer named Olександра Кониського made a handwritten copy of it before the original disappeared.
That is so lucky.
I know. And that single handwritten backup was eventually published in 1901.
It's crazy that one guy deciding to meticulously copy a poem by hand is literally the only reason this artifact didn't vanish into thin air.
It really highlights the fragility of historical records.
For sure. But here's the crazy part. The text Konisky saved wasn't even the poem Shevchenko originally set out to write. The author literally switched languages mid-thought.
He did. Yeah, if we look at Shevchenko's diary from late 1857 when he was living in Nizhny Novgorod, he originally noted this plan to write a satirical epic. And his initial plan was to write it in the Russian language under the title Satrap and Dervish.
Okay, wait, before we go further, just for those of us who aren't, totally up on our 19th century historical terminology, what exactly are a satrap and a dervish?
Oh, sure.
Why would he use those specific words for a Russian epic?
It's a great question. So a satrap was originally a provincial governor in the ancient Persian Empire, but by the 19th century, the word had become this metaphor for any local tyrant or despot who ruled with just absolute cruel authority.
Got it. Okay, and the dervish.
A dervish, on the other hand, refers to a Sufi Muslim ascetic, so someone who has taken vows of poverty and extreme religious devotion.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, so just in the title alone, Shevchenko is setting up this massive collision between corrupt secular tyranny and pure spiritual asceticism.
Okay, let's unpack this. He has his title, he has this grand clash of themes, and he plans to write it in Russian. Which makes sense, right, if he wants the entire empire to read his satire. But then, as you mentioned, he completely abandons that plan.
Right, because when he actually starts writing in December of 1857, the project takes a dramatic turn. I mean, he drops satrap and dervish. He drops the Russian language entirely.
He throws it out.
Exactly. Instead, he writes Yurodivyi in Ukrainian. And with that language shift came this massive tonal shift. He blended biting political satire with a deeply sincere, heroic focus on political exiles.
But why the pivot, though? I mean, why abandon the language of the empire if you want your political critique to be widely understood?
Well, because for Shevchenko, the Ukrainian language wasn't just a medium, it was the message itself.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. Russian was the language of the bureaucracy, the censorship, the military drill yards. Ukrainian was a language of the peasantry, the oppressed, and frankly, his own soul.
Right.
Switching to Ukrainian gave the poem a visceral, authentic voice of resistance that a Russian-language satire simply couldn't carry for him.
It's almost like a film director starting production on a cynical, high-budget political comedy in Hollywood. But halfway through, they realize the story is just too personal. So they fire the studio, grab a handheld camera, and pivot to making a raw, deeply sincere resistance documentary in their native language.
That is a perfect analogy, yeah.
But that raises an important question for me, honestly. The text we have today is just a fragment. It's an unfinished prologue. So why didn't he finish it? Did he just get writer's block, or did the secret police catch wind of what he was doing?
Well, literature professors often argue that the unfinished text serves a specific architectural purpose, that this prologue perfectly builds the oppressive atmosphere of the era before the main narrative begins.
Okay, sure.
And while that's true from a literary standpoint, the historical reality is much darker. Shevchenko had recently returned from a brutal 10-year exile. He was living in Nizhny Novgorod under strict, constant police surveillance.
The threat was very real.
Oh, incredibly real. His mail was read, his movements were tracked. To write what is essentially a manifesto tearing down the foundations of the Russian Empire, I mean, the sheer psychological toll and physical danger of that just cannot be overstated.
Yeah, I can't even imagine.
We don't know exactly why he stopped writing, but the environment of intense paranoia certainly played a role.
And when you look at the cast of characters he targets in this prologue, it's a miracle he wasn't immediately thrown back in chains. I mean, to understand the suffocating world Shevchenko is critiquing, we kind of have to decode his pseudonyms.
Right.
Because he doesn't name these historical figures directly, but he makes it very obvious who he's talking about.
Yes, he builds this brutal military bureaucratic nightmare by renaming the architects of that very nightmare. Let's start at the absolute top, Emperor Nicholas I, the Tsar of the Russian Empire.
Right. He calls the Tsar a feldwebel Tsar, which means a sergeant Tsar, as well as Sardanapalus and Mykola. But wait, let me challenge this for a second. Calling the absolute monarch a sergeant doesn't seem that bad. I mean, a sergeant is still a guy with a lot of authority. Why wouldn't he just call him a bloodthirsty monster or a tyrant?
Well, because calling someone a monster grants them a terrifying, almost mythological power. It acknowledges that they are a grand, sweeping force.
Oh, I see where you're going.
Right. But a feldwebel, a low-ranking, rules-obsessed disciplinarian that strips away all that imperial majesty. Nicholas Ley was infamous for what was called stick discipline. He ran the entire Russian state like a petty military barracks.
Okay.
By calling him a sergeant, Shevchenko is basically saying, you aren't a grand historical figure ordained by God. You're just a middle manager with a whistle who is obsessed with parade ground drills.
Okay, that makes so much sense. It's the 19th century equivalent of taking a terrifying dictator and turning him into a pathetic internet meme. You can't be terrified of someone if you're laughing at how small and petty they are.
Exactly. And that satirical mechanism trickles all the way down the hierarchy in the poem. Next in line is Dmitry Gavrilovich Bibirkov, the very real governor-general of Kiev, Podilsk, and Volyn from 1837 to 1852.
The man who gets slapped in the cathedral.
The very same. In the poem, Shevchenko strips away his grand governor-general title and simply calls him Corporal Gavrilovich the Armless, or cropped Gavrilovich.
The armless.
Yeah.
That is incredibly specific.
It is a direct reference to a major historical event. Bibirkov actually had his left arm amputated after being wounded at the Battle of Borodino in 1812 against Napoleon.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and Borodino was a point of immense aristocratic and national pride. But Shevchenko takes this sacred military wound and uses it to mock him as a cropped Gavrilovich.
Wow, he really went for it. And he keeps going, right? He takes aim at other officials, too.
He does. He mentions M.A. Dolgorukov, who was the governor-general of Chernihiv, Poltava, and Kharkiv. Shevchenko brands him the drunk under-officer. He also targets Emye Pizarev, an official in Bibikov's administration notorious for tyranny and extortion, calling him the little corporal. Finally, he calls out the profosi.
I've never heard that term. What is a profosi?
The profosi were the actual military police officials responsible for enforcing corporal punishment. They were the ones holding the whips, watching over the arrested, executing the physical violence of the state.
Oh, terrible.
So Shevchenko maps out this entire suffocating chain of command from the petty sergeant czar all the way down to the men holding the sticks.
Now, I think it's really important to pause here and just remind you, the listener, that our goal on this deep dive is simply to objectively report on the contents of these historical sources. We aren't taking a political stance or endorsing 19th century anti-monarchy views.
Of course not.
But historically speaking, writing this in the 1850s, systematically turning the most powerful men in the empire into petty, pathetic corporals and sergeants, was ideological dynamite.
It was incredibly dangerous. When you systematically strip away the regal aura of your oppressors, you expose the absurdity of their power.
And exposing that absurdity is what brings us right back to our opening scene, because you can only oppress people for so long before that tension just violently snaps. Which brings us to the actual plot of this prologue.
The main event.
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's go back to that slap in the cathedral in 1853. We have this young man who walks up and strikes Governor General Bibikov across the face. What actually happened to that young man?
Well, the authorities faced a massive psychological dilemma. They couldn't process this as a legitimate political protest. Think about it. If the state admits this man is protesting, they have to admit there is a valid reason to protest. They would have to acknowledge the system is flawed.
Oh, so they have to invalidate him completely.
Precisely. They immediately labeled the young man as insane. They legally declared him a Yurodivyi, which translates to a holy fool or a madman.
I see.
And under the guise of medical and spiritual madness, they quietly exiled him to hard labor.
This sounds exactly like a high-stakes, terrifying version of the Emperor's New Clothes. Everyone standing in that cathedral sees the tyranny. Everyone knows the system is deeply corrupt and violent, but the entire crowd pretends everything is fine just to protect themselves.
Yes, exactly.
Then this one solitary guy walks up, points out the truth, or in this case, slaps the truth into the open, and society immediately points at him and says, "Look at the crazy guy." How does Shevchenko use this concept of the holy fool in the poem?
What's fascinating here is how Shevchenko executes a complete thematic reversal. I mean, he looks at this event and flips the definition of madness on its head. He writes that the actual fools, the true Yurodivyi, are the passive, silent members of the crowd.
The people who just stood there and watched.
Yes. The people who watch this tyranny unfold day after day, year after year, and do absolutely nothing. In the text, he calls the crowd dumb, vile slaves.
So the bystanders are the crazy ones for accepting a system that crushes them. That is brilliant. But what about the slapper? How does Shevchenko describe him?
He elevates him entirely. He refuses to use the state's label of fool. Instead, Shevchenko calls the young man a holy knight.
A knight.
Yeah, he praises the solitary individual who possessed the immense courage to stand up to a kingdom of what he calls a million swineherds.
A million swineherds. That is such a visceral, aggressive image. It's the ultimate contrast between the passivity of the masses and the direct action of the individual. And that solitary act of rebellion by the holy knight seems to blow the doors off the poem because it opens up Shevchenko's broader ideological frustrations.
Oh, absolutely.
This leads to some of the most radical concepts in the entire text.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Shevchenko is really scaling up his critique here. He moves from regional governors and the Tsar all the way to the foundational pillars of society itself. And he introduces two major motifs that were incredibly far ahead of their time.
Let's start with the first one, because I honestly had to reread the sources when I saw this.
Yeah.
The George Washington symbol. Right in the middle of a 19th century Ukrainian poem about the Russian Empire. Shevchenko explicitly writes that he yearns for a Washington with a new and righteous law. How does a Ukrainian poet in the 1850s even know enough about George Washington to use him as a political symbol?
It really speaks to how powerfully ideas were moving across the globe despite heavy imperial censorship. Following the European revolutions of 1848, the American democratic experiment was viewed by a lot of intellectuals as a radical beacon of hope. For Shevchenko, Washington isn't just a historical guy. He is a potent shorthand symbol for a complete systemic overhaul.
Because Washington walked away from power?
Exactly. And because he helped build a system based on righteous law rather than the arbitrary whim of a monarch. When Shevchenko calls for a Washington, he is directly calling for a democratic republic.
Wow.
He is calling for elected officials. He is advocating for the total abolition of the autocracy. In a society where the Tsar's word was literally the law of God on earth, demanding a republic was a deeply revolutionary idea.
But he doesn't just stop at challenging the state. He goes after the divine justification for that state, too. The sources talk about the God-fighting motif in the poem.
Yes, and this is where the text reaches its most provocative peak. Shevchenko directly addresses the all-seeing eye of God.
And he has a serious bone to pick with it.
He does. He demands to know how this all-seeing divine eye can passively watch hundreds of holy captives, political exiles, innocent thinkers, revolutionaries, be driven in chains to Siberia, tortured, and hanged.
Right.
He aggressively asks how the divine eye can watch all of this immense suffering without going blind from the sheer horror of it.
Wait, I need you to explain the specific term here. The poem says the divine presence is sleeping in the kiat. What is a kiat?
A kiat is the glass case or wooden shrine used to hold religious icons in Orthodox homes and churches.
Okay, got it.
Usually it's a place of deep reverence and active prayer, but Shevchenko uses it to paint an image of stagnation. He's basically saying the divine presence is locked in a glass box, sleeping and gathering dust, while the czars run rampant and act without any moral restraint.
Let me make sure I'm fully grasping the danger of this.
Yeah.
To call out the emperor's absolute rule demanding a democratic republic, and to simultaneously suggest that the divine presence is asleep on the job. In 1850s Russia, wasn't that basically signing your own death warrant?
Without a doubt. The Russian Empire was entirely propped up on two primary pillars, autocracy and orthodoxy, the infallible Tsar and the infallible church.
Wow.
To attack both simultaneously, to suggest that the Tsar is just a petty sergeant and that God is asleep, was an ideological earthquake. This combined critique of state violence and spiritual complacency represents a profound demand for critical thinking. Again, as observers, we aren't validating or invalidating his theological views, but historically speaking, Shevchenko was demanding action. He was entirely rejecting the accepted idea that suffering was just a natural, divinely ordained order of things.
It's the ultimate rejection of the status quo. He's looking at every system of power and saying, you are all failing us. Which brings us to the end of what we actually have of this text. Where was Shevchenko planning to take this story before it was left unfinished?
This raises an important question, and the unwritten future of the poem is actually hinted at in the final lines of the prologue.
What does it say?
Shevchenko writes, I will fly to Siberia. I will lead you out into the light further on in long rows in chains. This definitively proves that Shevchenko was planning to expand the narrative far beyond that cathedral in Kyiv. He was going to take the story into the snowy depths of Siberia.
Who was he going to focus on in Siberia?
He wanted to focus on the exiled Decembrists as well as other political prisoners.
And for you listening who might not know, the Decembrists were the Russian military officers and aristocrats who staged a failed uprising in December of 1825, demanding a constitution. Right.
Exactly. After their rebellion failed, Nicholas the Son, the Feldwebel-Tsars, had them stripped of their titles and marched in chains to Siberian prison camps.
Right.
Shevchenko viewed his art as a mechanism for liberation. He wanted to be the one to metaphorically lead them out into the light through his poetry. He wanted to shine a spotlight on the people the empire tried to bury in the snow.
And that brings us full circle. Shevchenko promised to lead these exiles into the light, but he never finished the epic. We only have this prologue. Consider how much of our historical memory is shaped not just by the explosive events themselves, like a young man slapping a governor in a silent cathedral, but by the specific writers who managed to record those events before the evidence is erased.
It really is incredible.
If Olександр Кониський hadn't sat down and made that one handwritten copy, this entire act of rebellion, this whole radical vision of democracy and divine accountability would have vanished completely into the archives.
It is a sobering thought. Our connection to the past truly does hang by a fragile thread.
It really does. It leaves you wondering, what other holy nights have been entirely forgotten simply because the piece of paper their story was written on didn't survive? Something to mull over. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Keep asking questions, and we'll catch you next time.